Hello BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. We are reading Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope, and we are approaching the end of this novel. We are in the falling action sequence here, where Trollope, chapter after chapter, is trying to settle, to wrap up all of the plot lines that he's been spinning all this time. It's not all that hard to do in Barchester Towers. The falling action of other novels that Trollope wrote is much harder for him to do. You get the impression here there wasn't much going on. There wasn't much that wasn't foreordained. But one question that has remained open for a while is the dean, the office of the dean in Barchester, a powerful ecclesiastical office that Archdeacon Grantley and all of his fellows and his faction against the bishop don't want to see go to an ally of the bishop. They want an ally of their own in that place. So they're horrified at the idea that Mr. Slope, the bishop's chaplain, might get that job. And as we've seen, all of Barchester assumes that he will, including Mr. Slope. But we heard it brooded earlier during the climax of the book at Ullathorne Sports. We heard it brooded by a couple of people in the know that it might be Mr. Harding, the saintly former warden of Hiram's Hospital, who was the main character of the earlier book in this series, and who right now has a tiny living in Barchester. It barely makes any money at all. He lives in rooms above a shop on High Street. We've seen him humble and content in that role, telling his daughter, Eleanor Bold, that he's happy that someone else got the job of being the new warden because he wouldn't be fit for it. It would mean constantly fighting with the bishop and everybody else, and he doesn't want to do that. Mr. Harding comes into the story now in the chapter that we're dealing with today. The chapter that we're reading today is called The Dean-elect, and it is going to raise a question, just an everyday question. Did you ever know anybody? Do you know somebody in your life that you think is really good, really pure, you really love them, but they never cease to annoy the pee out of you? If you've known such a person, this chapter is going to be very recognizable to you. It's also be one of the only times in the book where you actually sympathize with Mr. Grantley. Let's see what the Dean-elect is all about. During the entire next week, Barchester was ignorant of who was to be its new dean on Sunday morning. Mr. Slope was decidedly the favorite, but he did not show himself in the cathedral, and then he sank a point or two in the betting. On Monday he got a scolding from the bishop in the hearing of the servants, and down he went till nobody would have had him at any price. But on Tuesday he received a letter, in an official cover, marked private, by which he fully recovered his place in the public favor. On Wednesday he was said to be ill, and that did not look well. But on Thursday morning he went down to the railway station with a very jaunty air, and when it was ascertained that he had taken a first-class ticket for London, there was no longer any room for doubt on the matter. While matters were in this state of ferment at Barchester, there was not much mental comfort at Plumstead. That's Plumstead Episcopi, the country home of Archdeacon Grantley. Our friend the Archdeacon had many grounds for inward grief. He was much displeased at the result of Dr. Gwynne's diplomatic mission to the palace, and did not even scruple to say to his wife that he had gone himself he would have managed to fare better. His wife did not agree with him, but that did not mend the matter. Mr. Quiverful's appointment to the hospital was, however, a fait accompli, and Mr. Harding's acquiescence in that appointment was not the less so. Nothing would induce Mr. Harding to make a public appeal against the bishop, and the Master of Lazarus quite approved of his not doing so. It's only Archdeacon Grantley that wants to fight this out. It's been decided. And it's going to the right recipient. Quiverful needs the money. I don't know what has come to the master, said the Archdeacon over and over again. He used to be ready enough to stand up for his order. My dear Archdeacon, Mrs. Grantley said in reply, what is the use of always fighting? I really think the master is right. The master, however, had taken steps of his own, of which neither the Archdeacon nor the wife knew anything. Then Mr. Slope's successes were henbane to Dr. Grantley, and Mrs. Bold's improprieties were as bad. What would be all the world to the Archdeacon Grantley if Mr. Slope should become Dean of Barchester and marry his wife's sister? He talked of it, and he talked of it till he was nearly ill. Mrs. Grantley almost wished the marriage were done and over, so that she might hear no more about it. And there was yet another grounds for misery which cut him to the quick, nearly as closely as either of the others. That paragon of clergymen whom he had bestowed upon St. Ewald, that college friend of whom he had boasted so loudly, that ecclesiastical knight before whose lance Mr. Slope was to fall and bite the dust, that worthy bulwark of the church as it should be, that honored representative of Oxford's best spirit, was, so at least his wife had told him a dozen times, misconducting himself. By this we mean Mr. Arabin, who's been seen doting on the Signora. Nothing had been seen of Mr. Arabin at Plumstead for the last week, but a good deal had unfortunately been heard of him. As soon as Mrs. Grantley had found herself alone with the Archdeacon on the evening of the Ullathorne party, she had expressed herself very forcefully as to Mr. Arabin's conduct on that occasion. He had, she declared, looked and acted and talked very unlike a decent parish clergyman. At first the Archdeacon had laughed at this, and assured her that she need not trouble herself, that Mr. Arabin would be found to be quite safe. But by degrees he began to find that his wife's eyes had been sharper than his own. Other people coupled the Signora's name with that of Mr. Arabin. The meagre little prebendary who lived in the close told him to a nicety how often Mr. Arabin had visited Dr. Stanhope's house, and how long he had remained on the occasion of each visit. He had asked after Mr. Arabin in the cathedral library, and an officious little vicar, Corll, had offered to go and see whether he could find him at Dr. Stanhope's. Rumor, when she has contrived to sound the first note of her trumpet, soon makes a loud peal audible enough. It was too clear that Mr. Arabin had succumbed to the Italian woman, and that the Archdeacon's credit would suffer fearfully if to give the Archdeacon his due, he was really attached to Mr. Arabin, and grieved greatly at his backsliding. They were sitting talking over their sorrows in the drawing-room before dinner on the day after Mr. Slope's departure for London, and on this occasion Mrs. Grantley spoke out her mind freely. She had opinions of her own about parish clergymen, and now thought it right to give vent to them. If you would have been led by me, Archdeacon, you would never have put a bachelor into St. Ewald's. But, my dear, you don't mean to say that all bachelor clergymen misbehave themselves. I don't know that clergymen are so much better than other men, said Mrs. Grantley. It's all very well with a curate whom you have under your own eye, and whom you can get rid of if he persists in improprieties. But Mr. Arabin was a fellow, and couldn't have had a wife. Then I would have found someone who could. But, my dear, are fellows never to get livings? Yes, to be sure they are, when they get engaged. I would never put a young man into a living unless he were married or engaged to be married. Now here is Mr. Arabin. The whole responsibility lies upon you. There is not at this moment a clergyman in all Oxford more respected for morals or conduct than Arabin. Oh, Oxford, said the lady with a sneer. What men choose to do at Oxford nobody ever hears of. A man may do very well at Oxford who would bring a disgrace on a parish. And, to tell you the truth, it seems to me that Mr. Arabin is just such a man. The Archdeacon groaned deeply, but he had no further answer to make. You really must speak to him, Archdeacon. Only think what the Thorns will say if they hear that their parish clergyman spends his whole time philandering with this woman. The Archdeacon groaned again. He was a courageous man, and knew well enough how to rebuke the younger clergyman of the diocese when necessary. But there was about Mr. Arabin something which made the doctor feel that it would be very difficult to rebuke him with good effect. You can advise him to find a wife for himself, and he will understand well enough what that means, said Mrs. Grantley. The Archdeacon had nothing for it but groaning. There was Mr. Slope. He was going to be made dean. He was going to take a wife. He was about to achieve respectability and wealth, an excellent family mansion, and a family carriage. He would soon be among the comfortable elite of the ecclesiastical world of Barchester, whereas his own protege, the true scion of the true church, by whom he had sworn, would be still a poor vicar, and that with a very indifferent character for moral conduct. It might be all very well recommending Mr. Arabin to marry, but how could Mr. Arabin, when married, support a wife? Things were ordering themselves thus in Plumstead drawing-room when Dr. and Mrs. Grantley were disturbed in their sweet discourse by the quick rattle of a carriage and a pair of horses on the gravel sweep. The sound was not that of visitors, whose private carriages are generally brought up to the country-house doors with demure propriety, but betokened rather the advent of some person or persons who were in a hurry to reach the house, and had no intention of immediately leaving it. Guests invited to stay a week, who were conscious of arriving after the first dinner bell, would probably approach in such a manner. So might arrive an attorney with news of a granduncle's death, or some son from college with all the fresh honors of a double first. No one could have had himself driven up to the door of a country house in such a manner who had the slightest doubt of his own right to force an entry. Who is it? Said Mrs. Grantley, looking at her husband. Who on earth can it be? Said the Archdeacon to his wife. He then quietly got up and stood with the drawing-room door open in his hand. Why, it's your father. It was indeed Mr. Harding, and Mr. Harding alone. He had come by himself in a post-chaise with a couple of horses from Barchester, arriving almost after dark, and evidently full of news. His visits had usually been made in the quietest manner. He had rarely presumed to come up without notice, and had always been driven up in a modest old green fly with one horse, that hardly made itself heard as it crawled up to the door. Good gracious, Warden, is it you? Said the Archdeacon, forgetting in his surprise the events of the last few years. Calls him Warden, just reflexively. But come in. Nothing the matter, I hope. We are very glad to see you come, Papa, said his daughter. I'll go get your room ready at once. I ain't Warden, Archdeacon, said Mr. Harding. Mr. Quiverful is Warden. Oh, I know, said the Archdeacon petulantly. I forgot all about it in the moment. Is anything the matter? Don't go this moment, Susan, said Mr. Harding. I have something to tell you. The dinner bell will ring in 5 minutes, said she. Will it? Said Mr. Harding. Then perhaps I had better wait. He was big with news which he had come to tell, but which he knew could not be told without much discussion. He had hurried away to Plumstead as fast as 2 horses could bring him, and now, finding himself there, he was willing to accept the reprieve which dinner would give him. If you have anything of moment to tell us, said the Archdeacon, pray let us hear it at once. Has Eleanor gone off? No, she has not, said Mr. Harding, with a look of great displeasure. He's displeased, not that she hasn't gone off, but that the Archdeacon still thinks she ever would. He knows a lot about what's going on that the Archdeacon doesn't know. Has Slope been made dean? No, he has not. But what? Said the Archdeacon, who was becoming very impatient. They have what? Said the Archdeacon. They have offered it to me, said Mr. Harding, with a modesty which almost prevented his speaking. Good heavens, said the Archdeacon, and sank back, exhausted, into an easy chair. My dear, dear father, said Mrs. Grantley, and threw her arms around her father's neck. So I thought I'd better come out and consult with you at once, said Mr. Harding. Consult? Shouted the Archdeacon. But, my dear Harding, I congratulate you with my whole heart. With my whole heart, I do indeed. I never heard anything in my life that gave me so much pleasure. And he got hold of both his father-in-law's hands and shook them as though he were going to shake them off, and walked round and round the room, twirling a copy of the Jupiter over his head to show his extreme exultation. But, began Mr. Harding. But me no buts, said the Archdeacon. I never was so happy in my life. It was just the proper thing to do. Upon my honor, I'll never say another word against Lord So-and-so the longest day I live. That's Dr. Gwynne's doing, you may be sure, said Mrs. Grantley, who greatly liked the Master of Lazarus, he being an orderly married man with a large family. I suppose it is, said the Archdeacon. Oh, Papa, I am so truly delighted, said Mrs. Grantley, getting up and kissing her father. But, my dear, said Mr. Harding, it was all in vain. He strove to speak. Nobody would listen to him. Well, Mr. Dean, said the Archdeacon, triumphing, the Deanery Gardens will be some consolation for the Hospital Elms. Well, poor Quiverful, I won't begrudge him his good family fortune any longer. No, indeed, said Mrs. Grantley. Poor woman has 14 children. I am sure I am very glad they have got it. So am I, said Mr. Harding. I would give 20 pounds, said the Archdeacon, to see how Mr. Slope will look when he hears it. The idea of Mr. Slope's discomfiture formed no small part of the Archdeacon's pleasure. At last Mr. Harding was allowed to go upstairs and wash his hands, having, in fact, said very little of all he had come out to Plumstead on the purpose to say. Nor could anything be more said till the servants were gone after dinner. The joy of Dr. Grantley was so uncontrollable that he could not refrain from calling his father-in-law Mr. Dean before the men, and therefore it was soon a matter of discussion in the lower regions how Mr. Harding, instead of his daughter's future husband, was to be the new dean, and various were the opinions on the matter. The cook and butler, who were advanced in years, thought it was just as it should be, but the footman and lady's maid, who were younger, thought it was a great shame that Mr. Slope should lose his chance. He's a mean chap all the same, said the footman, and I am along for him that I says so. But I always did admire the missus's sister. She'd well become the situation. They're not happy that Mr. Slope might be dean, but they'd like to see Eleanor Bold as the lady dean. While these were the ideas above stairs, a very difference of opinion existed. While these were the ideas downstairs, a very great difference of opinion existed above. As soon as the cloth was drawn and the wine on the table, Mr. Harding made for himself an opportunity of speaking. It was, however, with much inward troubling that he said, "It's very kind of Lord So-and-so, very kind. I feel it deeply, most deeply. I am, I must confess, gratified by the offer." "I should think so," said the Archdeacon. "But, all the same, I'm afraid I can't accept it." The decanter almost fell from the Archdeacon's hand upon the table, and the start he made was so great as to make his wife jump up from her chair, not accept the deanship. If it really ended in this, there would be no longer any doubt that his father-in-law was demented. The question now was whether a clergyman of low rank and preferment, amounting to less than 200 a year, should accept high rank, 1,200 a year, and one of the most desirable positions which his profession has to afford. "What?" said the Archdeacon. gasping for breath and staring at his guest as though the violence of his emotion had almost thrown him into a fit. What? I do not find myself fit for new duties, said Mr. Harding. New duties? What duties? Said the Archdeacon with unintended sarcasm. Not supposed to be giving away the game here, right? The new bishop came into Barchester saying, I don't want any idle sinecures. Here, Grantley's first objection is, a dean doesn't have any duties. He gets £1,200 a year for nothing. Oh, Papa, said Mrs. Grantley, nothing can be easier than what a dean has to do. Surely you are more active than Dr. Trefoil, the old dean. He won't have half as much to do as he has at present, said Dr. Grantley. Did you see what the Jupiter said the other day about young men? This is Mr. Harding, who has read the editorial that we read. Yes, I saw that the Jupiter said all it could to induce the appointment of Mr. Slope. Perhaps you would wish to see Mr. Slope made dean. Mr. Harding made no reply to this rebuke, though he felt it strongly. He had not come over to Plumstead to have further contention with his son-in-law about Mr. Slope, so he allowed it to pass. I know I cannot make you understand my feelings, he said, for we have been cast in different molds. I may wish that I had your spirit and energy and power of combating, but I have not. Every day that is added to my life increases my wish for peace and rest. And where on earth can a man have peace and rest if not in a deanery, said the Archdeacon. People will say that I am too old for it. Good heavens, people! What people? What need you care for any people? But I myself think that I am too old for any new place. Dear Papa, said Mrs. Grantley, men 10 years older than you are appointed to new situations day after day. My dear, said he, it is impossible that I should make you understand my feelings, nor do I pretend to any great virtue in the matter. The truth is, I want the force of character which might enable me to stand against the spirit of the times. The call on all sides now is for young men, and I have not the nerve to put myself in opposition to the demand. Were the Jupiter, when it hears of my appointment, to write article after article setting forth my incompetency, I am sure it would cost me my reason. I ought to be able to bear with such things, you will say. Well, my dear, I own that I ought, but I feel my weakness, and I know that I can't. And to tell you the truth, I know no more than a child what the dean has to do. Exclaimed the Archdeacon. Don't be angry with me, Archdeacon. Don't let us quarrel about it, Susan. If you knew how keenly I felt the necessity of having to disoblige you in this matter, you would not be angry with me. This was a dreadful blow to Dr. Grantley. Nothing could possibly have suited him better than having Mr. Harding in the deanery. Though he had never looked down on Mr. Harding on account of his recent poverty, he did fully recognize the satisfaction of having those belonging to him in comfortable positions. It would be much more suitable that Mr. Harding should be Dean of Barchester than Vicar of St. Cuthbert's, or Precentor to boot. And then the great discomfiture of that arch-enemy of all that was respectable in Barchester, of that new low-church clerical parvenu that had fallen amongst them, that alone would be worth more, almost, than the situation itself. It was frightful to think that such an unhoped-for good fortune should be marred by the absurd crotchets and unwholesome hallucinations by which Mr. Harding was allowing himself to be led astray. To have the cup so near his lips, and then to lose the drinking of it, was more than Dr. Grantley could endure. And yet it appeared as though he would have to endure it. In vain he threatened, and in vain he coaxed. Mr. Harding did not indeed speak with perfect decision of refusing the proffered glory, but he would not speak of anything like decision of accepting it. So he's not hard and fast. There's wiggle room there. When pressed again and again, he would again and again allege that he was wholly unfitted for new duties. It was in vain that the Archdeacon tried to insinuate, though he could not plainly declare, that there were no new duties. It was in vain that he hinted that in all cases of difficulty he, the Archdeacon, was willing and able to guide the weak-minded dean. Mr. Harding seemed to have a foolish idea, not only that there were new duties to do, but that no one should accept the place who was not himself prepared to do them. The conference ended in an understanding that Mr. Harding should at once acknowledge the letter that he had received from the minister's private secretary, and should beg that he might be allowed 2 days to make up his mind, and that during those 2 days the matter should be considered. On the following morning, the Archdeacon was to drive Mr. Harding back to Barchester. So, short chapter, that's the gist of it. Mr. Harding has been made the dean. The place has been offered to him. And he drives out to Plumstead Episcopi to tell Archdeacon Grantley, the last person on earth who would ever understand such a thing, that he doesn't think he's really up to it. That he's going to decline. And the upshot is that Grantley and also Mr. Harding's daughter get him to the point where he is not going to write and refuse. Just a couple of days. Now Grantley means to use those couple of days to wear Mr. Harding down. We can safely intuit that. How much of that will we see? Well, we have a few more chapters to go. Will Mr. Harding be the new dean? The perfect conclusion. He's not the new warden. He can't be the new warden without being vicious to a family that needs the position. He's not the new warden. He doesn't need the new position because his daughter is wealthy. So he could live with her if he needed to. The deanery is perfect, though, because it's a man of good repute. It's a saintly man who, after this chapter, you want to kick down a flight of stairs. So that is this chapter. We'll move on to the next one. We're rapidly approaching the end. I will wrap this up for now, and I will see you then. Thank you, BookTube.